The sun had already dipped behind the ridgeline when Eveline knelt by the small, uneven mound of earth. Widow's Creek lay quiet, save for the whip-poor-will's lonely call and the whisper of grass bending in the evening breeze. Eveline's hands trembled as she pressed the last stone into place, sealing the grave of her only child. Mary had been just 8 years old, a slip of a girl with braids that never stayed tied and laughter that rang like church bells on a Sunday morning. Now the ground that should have been her playground covered her still body. The townsfolk hadn't come. A few whispered excuses of too far, too dangerous after sundown, or simply silence when she asked. They'd always seen Eveline as different, too quiet, too stubborn, and since her husband's death to fever, too poor to be worth much kindness. So she dug alone, her grief sharp as the spade she drove into the soil. Each strike was a prayer, a confession, a scream she dared not voice. Her lantern burned low, casting thin shadows across the grave. Eveline brushed dirt from her dress, worn to threads at the knees, and tried to steady her breathing. She reached for Mary's small hand, stiff now, fingers curled around something crumpled and pale. At first, Eveline thought it must be a scrap of cloth, perhaps a handkerchief left from the sickness that had taken her. But when she pried the fingers open, her heart gave a jolt. It was paper, a folded note. Eveline's breath caught. She turned it in the light, careful not to tear it. Her name was scrawled across the front. Eveline, in a hand that was not her daughter's. The letters were strong, deliberate, a man's writing, though clumsy, as if written in haste. Her throat closed tight as she unfolded it. The words inside were few, smudged by dirt and the faint trace of a tear. Please forgive me. Her lantern shook in her grip. Forgive? Forgive what? Who had been with Mary in her last moments? No one from town had come near, she was sure of that. And the sheriff had barely tipped his hat when she told him Mary was sick, saying only, "The Lord's will, ma'am." Eveline pressed the note to her chest, her mind racing. Had someone seen Mary die? Had they touched her hand, tucked this paper inside before Eveline arrived to lay her to rest? Or worse, had someone played a hand in her death? A twig snapped beyond the graveyard fence. Eveline's head whipped around, lantern light darting across the shadows. The field stretched empty, but her skin prickled. She wasn't alone. She rose to her feet, skirts brushing the damp grass, and stuffed the note into her bodice. If someone had left those words with her daughter, then they might still be watching. She could not show weakness. She could not let fear rule her. But the truth pressed heavy on her chest. Eveline had buried her daughter alone. Yet she was not as alone as she thought. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, was the author of the note, and with every heartbeat, she knew she would not rest until she learned what sin those words carried. The lantern sputtered, and the night closed in. Eveline stayed on her knees long after the last shovelful of dirt covered her little girl's grave. The dusk deepened, and the prairie wind whipped loose strands of her hair into her eyes. She didn't wipe them away. It was as if her body no longer remembered how to move. Her daughter's small hand, still clutching that folded scrap of paper. Eveline had read the words once, but they seared her soul so fiercely she could not bring herself to unfold it again. The letters burned in her mind regardless. Please forgive me. Her lips trembled as she whispered the phrase to herself, half in disbelief, half in torment. Forgive who? Forgive what? The child had been too weak to write in those final hours. And there had been no visitors, no neighbors, no one who might have slipped such a message into that frail grip. The mystery gnawed at her grief like a wolf at bone. Each repetition of the words, "Please forgive me," felt like a wound, and yet also like a hand reaching out through the darkness, begging her not to turn away. The note felt like an intrusion, and yet, somehow, like a lifeline. She rose unsteadily, holding her shawl tight around her shoulders. The candle she had left on the wooden cross sputtered in the night air. And then she heard it. Hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, drawing closer along the dirt track that ran beside the graveyard. Her first thought was fear. A woman alone on the frontier was easy prey. She stepped back into the shadows, heart hammering. The rider came into view. A tall man on a dark bay horse, hat brim low, face unreadable in the half-light. He reined in, scanning the small graveyard, and his eyes fell on her. Eveline's throat tightened. Something about him, he seemed too still, too watchful. "Evening, ma'am," he said finally, his voice low, carrying over the wind. She couldn't answer. His gaze dropped to the fresh mound of earth. He dismounted slowly, respectfully, and stood there, hands open at his sides. "Your child?" Her breath caught. She wanted to scream at him, tell him to leave her in peace, but all she managed was a broken nod. The man knelt before the grave, removing his hat. Silence stretched long between them. And then, without looking up, he murmured words that froze her where she stood. "I'm sorry I couldn't save her." Eveline's knees went weak. The note in her pocket seemed to burn against her skin. She staggered forward, her voice raw. "It was you, wasn't it? You'd left the note." At last he looked up. In his eyes was something she had not seen in years. Sorrow that wasn't her own. "She wasn't alone," he said simply. "Not at the end. I sat with her when the fever took hold, when you'd gone to fetch water. She asked for you. I told her you'd be back soon. She gripped my hand, and then—" His voice broke, rough with grief. Eveline covered her mouth, choking back a sob. She remembered those final hours, rushing between the cabin and the creek, helpless against the fire in her daughter's small body. She had thought she left her alone. She had thought she had failed her. And now, this stranger, this man she had never seen before, he had been there when she could not. She fell to her knees beside the grave, tears streaming down her cheeks, the note crushed in her fist. Why would you do that for us? You didn't even know her." The man's shoulders tensed. He pressed his hat against his chest. "Because once, long ago, someone sat with my child when I couldn't. A neighbor, a kind soul. I never forgot. When I saw the smoke from your chimney, when I heard the coughing through the night, I couldn't stay away. Not again." Eveline's sobs tore through the quiet graveyard, raw and broken. The man's words pierced her like a knife, yet soothed her like a balm. The wind carried silence between them, thick with grief and something unspoken. Eveline gripped the edge of the wooden cross, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Don't leave me now. Please, don't leave me to bury her memory alone." The stranger's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered with conflict, with pain. He stepped back, as though distance might protect them both. "I should go," he murmured. Her hands shot out, clutching his sleeve, desperate. "Come back. She needs you." Her voice cracked. "I need you." The words hung in the air, fragile and pleading. The stranger looked down at her hand on his arm, then into her tear-stained face. His silence was a storm of guilt, of memories, of decisions he did not want to make. And in the distance, thunder rolled. The wind tugged at Eveline's shawl as the stranger's words sank into her bones. "I'm sorry. I couldn't save her." Her throat worked. No sound came. She had turned those words over in her mind ever since finding the note clenched in her daughter's tiny hand. Now, hearing them spoken, the pieces fell together like a cruel puzzle. "You," her voice cracked. "You left the note." The man's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes on the mound of earth as though it alone deserved his gaze. "I came too late," he said, voice rough as gravel. The fever had her in its grip already. "I should have knocked sooner, should have tried. But I didn't. When I finally stepped inside, there was nothing I could do. I wrote those words because they were all I had left to give." Eveline's heart pounded with 100 emotions, rage, grief, and something else she hadn't expected. Compassion. She had wanted to hate the faceless writer of that plea. Yet now, seeing the man's broad shoulders hunched as though under invisible weight, she saw not a coward, but a soul broken in its own way. Her hands trembled as she drew her shawl tighter. "I cursed you for those words," she whispered. "I begged to know why anyone would leave me with, 'Please forgive me.'" The man finally lifted his gaze to her, and in it she saw years of sorrow. "Because I know what it is to lose a child. Mine was a little girl. I never forgave myself, not once. And when I saw yours slipping away," his voice faltered. He pressed a hand to his chest, as though steadying something inside. "Maybe I was asking for forgiveness as much as I was offering it." The graveyard was silent, but for the sigh of wind through the pines. Eveline stared at him, the stranger who had haunted her nights and now stood here, flesh and blood. Slowly, almost against her will, she stepped closer. "You came back," she said, the words carrying more weight than she intended. "That's more than most would have done." He reached into his coat and drew out a small wooden carving, a bird, rough-hewn but delicate. He placed it gently atop the grave. "I carry them with me," he said softly, "for everyone I couldn't save. She deserved more than my silence." Eveline's tears blurred her vision. She lowered herself to her knees, brushing her fingers over the carving, then over the mound of fresh earth. "Then maybe we forgive each other," she said, her voice trembling but sure. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the man set his hat back upon his head and took a step back, as if the earth itself had decided his time here was finished. "Will I ever see you again?" Eveline asked before she could stop herself. The stranger's eyes softened, but he gave no promise. "You'll be all right," he said simply. "You're stronger than you think." And with that, he turned, leading his horse into the darkness. Eveline stood, the wind cold on her cheeks, but for the first time in days, her heart was not hollow. She placed her hand over the grave and whispered, to the night, to her daughter, and perhaps to the man fading into the shadows, "I do forgive you." And in that whisper, something inside her began to heal.